to the Gaia. Her predators will form a pyramid. Pagan goddess, pagan goddess, pagan goddess, heathen, pagan. Oh, how dare you, heathen and pagans. Oh, how dare you be outside of the organized, civilized, Orthodox Church of Christ. Haven't you gotten the memo? There's a new sheriff in town, you pagan heathens of the heath and the bush. So primitive. Today is the 29th of March, I believe. Yeah. It's pre-dawn, around almost 5:30 a.m. here. Sun should be rising soon. I'm gonna go get my computer to put by the phone to play more of the Joseph Campbell with Bill Moyers. Actually, I'm gonna play Ursula K. Le Guin with Bill Moyers, author of The Lathe of Heaven, while I'm in the shower, and then hopefully the sun will, I'm pretty sure it'll start, you'll see the change in light here, perched in front of the window. Let me get something to put the phone on. So it's a proper order to the Gaia. Her predators will form a pyramid. Mankind breeding out of proportion. A teetering pyramid. Oops. Diane, I dropped you again and again and again. Diane. Oh, jeez, Diane. Diana Ross. Upside down, you're turning me. You're giving love and string to me. If we do a really good job with vaccines and reproductive services, I said this, I'm Bill Gates, and I said this in 2010. If we do a really good job with vaccines and reproductive services, then we can see that population number go down. Just give us 9 years and we will have our Operation Warp Speed. Yes. Operation Warp Speed will do all kinds of warp-speeded horror on humanity. That was an attempt. That was just like, I didn't even consciously think of imitating Dr. Strangelove there. It just kind of happened. It was like Dr. Strangelove and meets Yoda meets Bill Gates. A proper order to the Gaia. Actually, rather, yeah, no, I will. I was going to play off Mice and Men with Being John Malkovich here, where it stopped while I was asleep last night, but had this on as I went to bed. George is going to be mad if you yell. Poor George. Poor John Malkovich. Being John Malkovich equals 88. A proper order to the Gaia from Zia in Boston, 1992. Lathe of Heaven interview with Bill Moyers. Ursula K. Le Guin. Damn ads.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help.
Oh, Grammarly.
This sentence is grammatically correct.
Shut up. I'll teach him grammar for free, you fucks. Tetragrammaton. Don't want to have this too loud.
Ursula K. Le Guin is one of our preeminent writers of science fiction and science fantasy, and she's equally accomplished in many other fields. She's written 20 novels, 11 books for children, 9 books of poetry, 7 collections of short stories, and 2 collections of essays. She's won all the prestigious awards in science fiction, and she's won the National Book Award. She's living, writing, and teaching now in the San Francisco area. Thank you for being with us. Let's begin with talking about Lathe of Heaven, because our viewers have just seen the film version of it, and it's very much on their mind and my mind. Is that all right?
What happened?
20 years ago, public television came to you and they said, we want to make a film out of one of your books. Which one? And you chose this one. Why this one?
David Larson came, this beautiful, tall Englishman. And he said, we want to make a movie. I said, wonderful. Which book? And he said, The Lathe of Heaven. And I said, oh, that's impossible. You can never make a film out of that. And he said, why not? And I said, because nothing happens in it. Things sort of unhappen in it, you know. I don't think it's dramatic. And he said, yes, it is. We'll show you. And I guess he did. I was very skeptical.
You were very skeptical?
Yeah. I guess I was hoping maybe that they'd make The Left Hand of Darkness. But as he pointed out...
Because it was much more visual.
Yes, and also much, much, much more expensive. And we
Welcome
didn't
to
have very much. Yes. We had $250,000 to work with, and that was it.
I remember now reading a chronicle you wrote of those days, particularly the days in Dallas when they were filming, and you seemed to be having a good time.
I was having a ball. Because, of course, I didn't have to... I had done all my work years before. I'd written the book, you know, so I was just watching the choreography of shooting a film. And shooting a film they only had 2 or 3 weeks. It was a short period. So it was very choreographed, and they were working 10, 12, 14-hour days. And I didn't know how many people it takes to make a film, and how the way they work together. It's beautiful.
You said it was beautiful. How so?
A whole lot of people really good at what they're doing. Specialists in the various things.
The director and the stage manager and the actors.
All the guys, those long lists of people in the credits, you know, watching them all knowing what they're doing, all doing it together. It really is beautiful. It is like a dance.
You had written the book. Somebody else wrote the screenplay. What was the difference that struck you between the writing for the novel and the writing for the screenplay?
Well, the novel is very wordy, and the screenplay has to be fairly unwordy, and to do it through imagery, visual imagery, above all. And learning to think that way was hard for me, because I'm very much a word person and an ear person.
But writing for film is writing for the eye as well as for the ear.
Primarily, I see it as writing for the eye. I mean, first, it's the eye thing, and what people say is really important. I mean, a good script makes all the difference, but it's secondary.
Do you remember the impact of the original broadcast?
Well, when they showed it in Portland, we were already, Portland, Oregon, where I live. We sat down in front of the television and we saw the first 2 minutes, and then there was a total power failure in my corner of the city. So that was glorious but brief.
I'm sure someone must have thought it was an anticipation of things to come, because in the novel you project that Portland will melt down in April of 1998.
Mm-hmm. I felt very responsible for that project. What did I do?
Well, you know, this was public television's first made-for-television film.
I don't think I realized that at the time.
It was. By the way, it's also the most requested film ever in the PBS archives.
Well, that I know, because they all wrote me and said, where can we get the movie? And I said, right PBS.
And yet, there was a stigma about science fiction in those days that caused the producers of the program to refer to The Lathe of Heaven as speculative fiction, not science fiction. Was that a difference without a distinction?
Kind of. I mean, there's sci-fi, and there's science fiction, and there's spec-fic, speculative fiction. They all have the initials SF, and we all know what they're talking about. And it is, I think, one of the liveliest genres of fiction. Science fiction, one of its differences from fantasy, to me, is that it doesn't contradict science. But it goes on and invents just as freely as fantasy does otherwise.
But fantasy doesn't really have to play by any of the rules of physics or the
Fantasy makes up its own rules. It's a much older genre, and its roots are deeper. And of course there's an enormous element of fantasy in this book, in that for some reason George's dreams come true. That's fantasy.
And he has a power he didn't want with consequences he didn't intend.
Right.
What was it about that story, do you think, that touched such a nerve when it was, both when it was read and then when it was visualized? What is there about The Lathe of Heaven that created that response at the time and continues to this day to create a profound and loyal following?
It's kind of like old fairy tales where somebody's trying to do good and is always sort of defeated by reality, because trying to do good, it just isn't enough. You've also kind of got to be realistic. You've got to go with the flow. You can't push the river, as the Buddhists say. And poor Haber in the book is a do-gooder who's self-defeated. He isn't defeated by anybody evil. He's not evil. He means well all the way through the book. But he's doing it wrong. And I think people are kind of intrigued by that.
Do you think they find in their own lives that the more good they want to do, sometimes the more harm they do?
If they're kind of doing it in this very aggressive way of, we're going to make war on this and set it right and so on. Whereas George, who seems very passive, but George is sort of in tune with things.
Go with the flow man.
Go with the flow man. And, of course, this is a Taoist book. The Taoism was pretty conscious.
What do you mean by that? A lot of people say, what does she mean, a Taoist book?
Well, just in the crudest sense, the Taoism says you do things by not doing things. And all attempt to do and to set things right and to make things happen eventually backfires.
There are no bad guys in this book. That's one of the things that struck me.
I'm not very good at bad guys.
Why?
I don't know.
You don't see
I'm
the
just
word?
so sweet naturally. I don't know. I don't find villainy in itself very interesting. I find the attempt, the normal attempt to just do good and get through life much more interesting.
There's a quote, in fact, in the book from a Chinese philosopher, quote, "To let understanding stop at what cannot be understood is a high attainment. Those who cannot do it will be destroyed on the lathe of heaven."
By the way, it's a terrible mistranslation, apparently. I didn't know that at the time. There were no lathes in China at the time that was said. Joseph Needham wrote me and said, so it's a lovely translation, but it's wrong.
Darn it. Did you send a letter back and say, please, unopened?
No, I said, thank you very much, Mr. Needham. I'm so pleased you read my book.
But why did you choose the title, The Lathe of Heaven? I mean, explain that to us.
Well, I love that quotation. And that's essentially what happens to poor Dr. Haber. He is destroyed on the lathe of heaven. He has taken on too much. He's what you could call hubris.
The sense I get from the lathe of heaven is that we, as you see things, we can't bear our dreams to come true because trying to change the cosmic order is just impossible. Is that a fair statement?
Well, dreams coming true, of course, again, there's a sort of there's a good side to that and a bad side to that. I think when the aliens come in, I mean, there is a sort of third force in this novel. There's Haber representing progress and change, and there's Orr representing a kind of putting the brakes on that and just sort of, well, maybe let's just see what happens by itself sort of attitude, you know. And because things get going so very badly with Haber's ability to change everything very rapidly and very drastically, this somehow seems to attract these sea turtles from Aldebaran, or is it? It's a long time since I wrote this book. I think they're from Aldebaran. And who are they? They seem to sort of float in and try to calm things down. And I mean, please don't ask me who they are or what they represent or what they mean, because I don't know. They just came into the book when I needed them.
Well, I like the fact that, I mean, my favorite scene in the book is that after they come here from wherever they came from, they end up selling hot dogs and antiques. I mean, that's true and total globalization. That creatures from outer space wind up being Americanized after they get here.
The point is they're easily satisfied, you see. They don't want to change everything. hey, hot dogs, great, let's sell hot dogs. They're so they have this sort of easygoingness, which I think is something that we don't give enough credit to.
Just going with the flow as
Going with the flow,
as
just
the
taking it a little bit easy. Yeah.
Do you just write the book and then let other people figure it out?
Yeah. So satisfying. I do get asked to interpret myself, but I'm never sure that my interpretation is the right one.
But you wrote the darn thing.
And in this one, you see, in this one where I keep pulling the rug out from under the reader, in a sense, I keep changing reality on him. I think it is part of the nature of the book that in fact there is no final interpretation or final meaning.
No closure. No closure.
The book is a kind of an exercise in just saying you can't quite ever grasp reality.
I thought they did a good job in the film, by the way. I didn't know how they would film the unreality, the film the dream, but they did it the same way they shot the rest of the film, almost documentary fashion.
We went and talked to Dr. William Dement at Stanford, who's the great dream researcher.
Right.
And he and I had corresponded before that. He's an extremely nice man. And he and David Logston and some of the others talked about how to do the dreams. And the general consensus was the dreams, when you're in a dream, it isn't fuzzy around the edges, and it isn't different colors. It's just like a reality, so film it like reality.
And he's right, that my own dreams, those that I can remember, are very sharp, very clear.
Yeah, they're real while you're there.
You once said that when you were talking about writing, you said that you find your characters. They exist in their own right, and all you have to do is look at them. So my question is, where did you find George Orr?
I should have said they find me, maybe. And rather than look at them, I've increasingly realized that what I do is listen. That my job as a novelist and a poet is just to listen.
To
Some words that are going to come to me. And sometimes it's somebody's voice, like a character. But sometimes it's just the words, and then that might just be a poem. Words with a resonance and a beat, a rhythm. Sometimes the rhythm comes first and the words come later. But with characters, it's like all of a sudden, sort of, there's George, and George has things to tell me. He has a story to tell me.
Get your ass, I
It
guess.
sounds terribly mystical.
well, it sounds very creative.
So I sit around and wait, as it were. My job when I'm not writing, like this period in my life, is I finished a couple of novels. I just have to wait for the well to refill and for somebody to come talk to me. And then sometimes I simply follow the character. Sometimes I don't plan much. This I couldn't plan very much because of the constant change of the dreams. I sort of had to let George dream and find out what he dreamed and then figure out what April would do with it. Which was fun.
So when you started out, you didn't know where this was going to take you or you were going to take it? the story.
Pretty much.
Characters.
I think this is the first book I wrote that I pretty much winged it.
I read that you do like to think it through and know where you're going.
Yeah, I think to start a novel without a pretty clear idea of where you're going to end up is unwise, tactically speaking. I've tried it too often and got stuck on page 40, because I didn't know where I was going, where the book was going. But you don't always know how you're going to get there. Sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. It varies from author to author, and certainly with me from book to book. And this one was probably the first time I just sort of said, how can I tell where this book is going if he's going to dream the world new every couple of chapters? How could I plot that out without just getting inside some sort of a cave?
Except for his dreams, George is such an ordinary guy.
Yeah, I like George. He's a nice guy. He's very strong. He's really, he really resists Saber all the way through.
But some critic call him a moral jellyfish.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I use the jellyfish image. I think that critic would, the book starts with an image of jellyfish drifting. Because I love that image because nothing is more passive than a jellyfish in a sense. Some of them can't really steer themselves. They just follow the currents. And yet, they're a very successful, beautiful old life form. I wouldn't want the ocean to not have jellyfish.
And they have survived.
They have survived through many eons.
Like the ordinary George Orrs. I don't want to carry this too far. But...
No, but exactly, that's it. Like George, he gives when he has to give. He hangs in there when he has to hang in there, and he survives. And poor Haber doesn't.
Would the story have been different if the dreamer had been a woman?
I have wondered that. If the dreamer had been a woman and then we had Dr. Haber, there would have been the whole gender thing about a man pushing a woman around, which I think would have been wrong. It's nothing to do with the story. And it would have put in a slant that would have been merely confusing, I think. Haber could be a woman, which would have been kind of interesting, and George a man.
Why could he have been?
Well, because they're people, it isn't a gender thing. Haber's general, his ambition, his wish to do good, his wish to control, that's not male. That's human.
For a while after you started writing, your protagonists were male. Then in the late 1970s, I think, with The Eye of the Heron, the male protagonist in that novel simply says one day, well, he insists on dying, and he dies.
He gets himself shot.
And the heart of the story becomes his sidekick, a woman. Was that a deliberate move on your part?
No, it took me by surprise, and I sort of told poor Liv, you can't die on me. And he said, but that's what I have to do, sort of. Which made me realize that he wasn't the center of the book, and that the woman was. And I had to sort of adjust to that, and
How so? What difference does it make?
I don't know what difference it makes
in the creative process?
Yeah. It was just a place I had to go. when I started writing, the easiest thing for a woman to do was, in a sense, to be an honorary man, to pretend she was a man, to put men at the center of the story, which does seem to be very important to men. Girls are used to pretending to be men or women protagonists. Boys very often refuse to identify with a woman protagonist in kids' books. And this seems to go on into adulthood, that men just can't have their masculinity compromised even by pretending to be a heroine for a little while. But this strikes me as kind of sad and probably not necessary. Because I think most men and women have both men and women inside them, lots of them, and are capable of being much more than they're told they're capable of being. So, anyway, when I realized, finally, thanks to feminists, that, I sort of had to sit down and say, well, ain't I a woman? And if I am a woman, why am I writing as a man? And it was a big step for me, because there are differences in sensibility, there are differences in audience. I knew I would lose some audience if I put women at the center of a story. I knew I would get accused of being a shrill and ranting feminist, which I was. But it was worth it because it kind of put me more in the center of my own being, to not pretend that I was male or that I thought that the world revolved around men. So I think it strengthened my writing a good deal.
Do you think that if you were writing The Lathe of Heaven today because of this, you would write it differently?
That's always a tough question. But the book pretty much did what I wanted to do, so therefore, why would I change it?
And what was it did?
Be itself. Just say whatever it is it says.
It's a good
Tell
story.
the story, yeah.
Did you write it with a message?
No.
Just to tell a good story?
No. But there is this whole aspect of the story is this kind of combat between a strong, powerful, dominating will and an apparently weak, passive, non-dominating will. There's a struggle going on, and that struggle does have meanings, but I don't think it has a message exactly.
And people can take different meanings from it according to their...
So.
Yeah.
Yeah, because a novel is a